So, week 5, Beyond the Jesus Seminar. So, as a feminist biblical scholar, I spend a lot of time trying to, wrap my head around the conversations that I'm reading, finding nuggets that are useful and productive for you all. I find myself wanting to ask, what are we doing with this? What are we doing with our understanding of Jesus, right? What are we doing with it? And on a certain level, are we actually interested in changing our understanding? To what extent? How far are we interested in changing or transforming our understanding of who Jesus was, why he was killed, what that led to, of right the movements and the things that came after him, the origins of what we refer to as Christianity. Like, to what extent are we interested in actually transforming what we think? To what extent do we want or need to? Back to Keith's point about, which I never met Marcus, but apparently something he would say, right? There needs to be a radical transformation. And I, as a biblical scholar, as a feminist biblical scholar, as someone who's very connected to and committed to justice in the world, in particular when people have underscored injustice but with scriptural backing. Like, I care about what we do with this stuff. I care a lot more about that than I do about figuring out the right answer here. And in fact, one of the reasons that set of playful, but not just playful, profiles of Jesus, and profiling we could maybe take to be in such perhaps in a politically and socially challenging way as it is often used today. In particular, I did share that tonight because of the woman piece at the end, and because of the questions going through my mind, because one of the attendees at the first week asked for my particular opinion as a feminist scholar, and I haven't really shared that yet. Tonight seemed like a good night to do that. And one of my brothers lives in LA, or outside LA, and his wife, I think of her as my sister, not just sister-in-law, feels very scrubbed or something, but I think of her as a sister. So my sister, every now and then, takes pictures of the newspaper and asks me what I think about these things. And so I am a little bit detached from reality right now. It's been a heavy few months. I don't know. Last week has been a lot. So when she sent this to me today and she was asking my opinion, I loved it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this actually plays in quite nicely. What is this? So I don't know if you all heard about this. It was news to me, genuinely. So that's why I was grateful she shared. Had you heard about this? Just to be clear, Pope, the title, this is from LA Times, Pope expands women's role at Mass, right? So Pope Francis changed church law Monday to allow women to do more things during Mass, granting them access to the most sacred place at the altar. But he continued to affirm that they cannot be priests. Francis amended the law to formalize and institutionalize what was already common practice in many parts of the Roman Catholic world, specifically that women can be installed as lectors to read from Scripture, but not from the Gospel, and serve at the altar as Eucharistic ministers. Previously, such roles were officially reserved for men, even though exceptions were made. The Pope said he was making the change to increase recognition of the precious contribution women make in the church, while emphasizing that all baptized Catholics have a role to play in the church's mission, so forth and so on. Precious contribution. So Francis, then coming over to this side, Francis has created a second commission of experts to study whether women could be deacons after a first one failed to reach a consensus. So I have lots of thoughts about this, especially since I do teach at a Catholic institution, which never ceases to amaze me that they don't mind keeping me around. So my sister asked me, she said, this seems to me to be a step in the right direction. And she said, but the last paragraph or two of the article makes it sound like it's not. And she's like, what do you think? So my response was to focus in on this particular paragraph that I have oddly highlighted from my phone, So the fact that, just in all just honesty, right, and candor, he created a commission previously to decide if women could be something. That, to me, biblical scholar or not, says everything, right? What is the source that you're going to turn to make a decision about what a woman can and cannot be? And the fact that he tried and they couldn't come to a consensus. Again, none of this really surprises people, right? On some basic level, for me, that's the problem, right? That it doesn't surprise us that they couldn't come to a consensus. This isn't about taking down or addressing the Catholic Church. That's not what I'm trying to do here tonight. My point is, it didn't work before. The premise itself is flawed. And the sources they're turning to are going to be filtered or selected according to their own biases, right? I mean, the fact that you're going to ask that particular question at all, and that you're going to turn to a 2,000-year-old, at best, collection of writings to answer a question in the 21st century. I mean, it tells us that he already thinks that women are not actually equal and called, right? And so that bias, he and they are going to find scripture to justify, just like we saw examples of people finding passages and issues or stories to justify or explain or build up a particular profile. So are you all seeing why I'm bringing this issue up tonight? Not just because it's something that happened today. And if you do, would you like to say something about how you're seeing a connection?
Well, I mean, for me, one of the issues, I'm thinking about recent work on what's called memory studies and the issue of why certain communities saw Jesus the way they did, why they, to use a word from my field, intertextualized him in certain ways, that is, put him into text in certain ways to create a certain kind of persona. And then that's the tradition we've inherited. And that's the tradition that people point back to, even though if you look carefully at it, you see, oh my goodness, there were women who did this and this and this. And oh yeah, there was that name that probably was a woman's name, but it kept getting translated as a man's name because it made people uncomfortable that a woman could have had some authority, though it's pretty clear they did have authority. And so it's the issue of thinking about trying to understand. This gets back to for me, why the historical Jesus questions are important. What can we understand about what probably was going on there, and how can we read against the traditions that we have to get a better understanding of that? Because after all, I mean, right now, regardless of what the Pope says, okay, it finally happened, but Jonathan and I went to a confirmation service for a friend of our son, a gay friend of ours adopted son. And guess what? A Catholic church, guess what happened? There were women serving at the altar. There were women reading, but not the gospel. And so it's like, this has been going on, but okay, now it's official. And so like that again reminds us that, okay, the authorities say one thing, but then what people are actually doing on the ground is often really quite different. And so all of these things for me are relevant to the discussions we've been having.
I mean, I appreciate this really important distinction, and what's going on the ground has always been different than or that, and then some other possibilities or manifestations, right? That has been the case always, right? That what's happening is different than what's official, even if what's official is perhaps what the majority are doing or whatever, that there've always been people doing something other, which is part of why we had the need for closing the canon, right, for the Newer Testament, as well as other movements and things that happen. So I think that's an important distinction to make. But that their particular source for this decision is going to be a 2,000-year-old collection is noteworthy, right? Does anyone else see connections between this debate, this conversation about the ordination of women in the Catholic Church, and the conversations about the historical Jesus?
One obvious parallel to me is they're looking to experts, and we're looking to experts to talk about what Jesus said. I think the idea of what an expert isn't necessarily parallel, but that's the same word, and it means different things, I guess, to different people in different contexts.
I guess for me, Jennifer, churches and universities are slow to change, right?
Fair
Just
enough.
given their institutional longevity.
Sure.
So for me, the conversation about the historical Jesus needs to happen over and over and over again. And slowly but surely, we begin to see things, right, differently. This, making this stuff formalized wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, right? So
right.
The conversation needs to be continually happening
right.
for that to change. Because we glean insights a little bit at a time, right? That's why I'm here, because it helps me to understand more fully who I am and what my part in this is. And
Lovely.
So that's why I don't want the conversation ever to stop, no matter how flawed. So that's for me, the piece.
Okay. Were you a professor?
No, but I did a lot of volunteer work with universities and various things, sat on various committees. So that was my comment around universities.
Yes, you had a connection there. Wasn't sure what it was. I'm going to move on. Perhaps what you're getting is a little bit of a tour of my mind today. I don't know, maybe making connections between these conversations, very important conversations. And I don't mean my focus on that particular issue, right, to be specifically about judgment or criticism specifically. It's more of a conversation. For me, it's a manifestation of the same conversation. It's a manifestation of the same fairly rooted component of this larger conversation for Christians in the 21st century. What are your touchstones in this whole picture, right? For you, who is, one of the scholars I was reading today said, we can get behind the evidence to the historical Jesus. It just so happens that my Jesus is the one I believe in, and my Jesus looks a little different than Dom Crossan's does, but he believes in his Jesus. And just like when this was written, I guess before Marcus had died, maybe not, but yes, before. Then he's like, and Dom, Crossan, Borg has his own depiction of Jesus, and he believes in his Jesus. And so and N.T. Wright has his, and all these guys have their own Jesus, and they believe in them. Even if you're atheistic and you're having this conversation, there's a Jesus back there that you are bringing forth, even if it's one you say you don't put much faith in. There's still a Jesus there that you believe existed.
Doesn't that presume that you believe that Jesus actually existed?
No, it presumes that, well, I suppose so. I suppose so at the end of the day. I think to be fair, Martha, I think that some people posit a human who went through essentially what's described. And the thing is, we could have picked, there's a similar guy in the previous century and a similar guy 40 years later and a similar guy 100 years later, right? And so there's a kernel of truth in terms of historical reality and plausibility. And so that there's a person we can hang it on. Now, whether that person that we're pointing to here, did everything that's associated with him or attributed to him, that's the difference here, for the most part, right? And then there are, of course, some scholars who think that, I guess I don't know well, I do know the point, but I guess it goes beyond the point of the conversation here tonight. But there are some who posit that there wasn't a person, which I think I just have a hard time going there entirely, because I think some days I'm there, but it doesn't, but for me, I don't know what that gains any of us. Because there's a tradition. There is this tradition, and we have the stories, and the stories are powerful, and the stories connect human understanding and ideas and create community and all these, and identity and connection and belonging, and someone to bury you when you die, which is the main reason for some of these social clubs, right? I just don't know, like there are scholars today who want to argue that there wasn't a person, and I just don't know the productivity of that, I guess. What I see in the scholarship, though, is essentially varying degrees of what any one scholar is willing to posit as being historically accurate or being historically plausible or reliable, right? And that spans the spectrum, right? Interesting, though, that Keith had brought up memory theory, because that is did I address your question, Martha, enough for now? Okay. Yeah, because the primary significant element of historical Jesus or Jesus studies of the last 20 years is this trying to essentially, actually getting back to Detlef's point, right? Reassessing our understanding of memory as it plays into this whole picture, right? What is the role of memory in terms of going from the people who were around? I mean, Martha's question or point is actually entirely relevant, right? Was there a person who did all these things, who traveled around Galilee, who, had this grassroots movement that he, helped to spark or whatever? I'm just going to posit that, yeah, there was somebody who did that. The role of memory, right? So the people who were with him, who actually traveled with him, did he actually have people travel with him? Was there a guy that actually traveled with 12 or 13 other guys, 14 other guys, because there's the lists differ between gospels, and a few women? Like, did that happen? So getting from the eyewitness, those in the close circle, those who perhaps attended one of or many of the gatherings that he might have caused, the eyewitnesses to these events, positing that these events happened, or at least half of them, right? The role of memory in passing down the stories, the role of memory in creating the tradition, and so forth. So this has been the most significant element of Jesus scholarship that's developed. So what's I think a bit frustrating, perhaps, for me, is that there's very little for me to bring to you. And I don't mean any disrespect to these scholars who spend their, but I do struggle with it a little, because there was very little that was actually nuanced or different to be able to present to you that there's this great insight that this wave of reconsideration brings to us. There just isn't that much that's. So this, I'm bringing just a few of the ideas to you, and I'm wondering if you, working it over a little bit, if this helps you to think about your own mental framework for how you process this conversation, or how you envision it, how you talk about it in your own head, whatever it is that you do in this conversation, right? I read this quote last week. History exists only from out of a present. So the only way to have a history is because we have artifacts or evidence. They call it lots of different things in this realm. There is evidence that people in the present interpret to give us something that we call history. So that the element of creation, right, that a recollection, even an eyewitness recollection, the memory is stored in a couple different ways in our minds, so that when we bring it back to the forefront to share with a friend, there is always an element of creation. There's a weaving together that happens every single time. One of the scholars I was reading was talking about how we should look at or think about the Gospels themselves. Think of them as transparent narratives, aiming at interpretations of their own situation, which connects us back to the first set of profiles, right? So they are transparent narratives that are aimed at interpretations of their current situation by way of creating portraits of the earthly Jesus from their later perspective, right? So we're looking back at Jesus to interpret and tell a story about here from this later perspective. We're doing, right, consciously or not, we are doing all of that. Does this bring any thoughts, comments to mind for anyone?
Yeah, for me, it's like the discussions right now about what happened last Wednesday. And the people who say, oh, they're patriots and this is the American Revolution all over again, and I'm part of that war. And that's one narrative. They're reading from the present into the past and the past into the present. And then there's another group of us who say, no, that is not, first, that's not what the present is about. And that's not what the American Revolution was about in a lot of ways. So what we've got is these conflicting views of the present and the past. And we're interpreting the past through the present and the present through the past.
Competing narratives.
All of that, yes, and all of that is determined by our current ideology.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Our need for something.
Right. Only with Jesus, you get, 2 millennia of it and a whole lot more institutions and a whole lot more countries and cultures.
Yeah, of course, yeah. The issue of needs, right? What we need to justify as well as want to justify. To what extent are we conscious of those playing into this whole process?
For me, this raises that classic question of, is truth knowable? The epistemological question of, are we all just making up our own reality? Is there any ability to say, this person has got a little bit more of a grip on the reality of the situation than that person? Does it make any sense to be able to say, yeah, and thank you, Keith, I think that's a wonderful example. And to say, yeah, but those people that are involved in the QAnon conspiracy are factually out of touch with reality. And we can just say that with confidence that we may all be in some kind of relative soup of our own creation, but some people are a little closer to reality than others. That it's not a binary either or, but because if we give up on truth altogether, then we're all screwed. And then it's just power wins. Whoever can exercise power the best is going to win the day and create history from their perspective. And that's such a nihilistic argument, I can't accept it. You know what I mean? But I love this conversation, it's so important.
What I really appreciated about Marcus Borg was that he helped me to use his kind of critical knowledge to form a perspective on Jesus that I could believe in. And I think some of it is because we were both Lutherans. We both grew up in North Dakota. And I've shared his books with other very spiritually mature people, and they say, well, yeah, that's okay, but I don't see anything great in it. So, I think it's kind of a blend, like Matthew was indicating, of the historical objective aspects of biblical scholarship, and then the way we put that together in our own individual lives.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean, though, in that the way that Marcus talked about Jesus in a critical way spoke to you very powerfully and still speaks to you very powerfully, but that might not have been the same maybe struggle that someone else needed to overcome or needed to help them appreciate.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that did come up in this back and forth between these scholars is that Dale Allison, who is who is respected in this collective, if you will, the historical Jesus scholarship, made a couple different comments about, quoting him here, the frailty of human memory should distress all who quest for the so-called historical Jesus. I think I may have written down another quote, but I'm not sure. Yeah. So this issue of the more you know about human memory, how faulty it can be, the more concerning this all becomes. So that there, at least within historical Jesus scholarship, there was kind of a wave of engaging cognitive psychological research a little bit out of context. And so, I mean, we do that, right? People do that intentionally or often unintentionally, right? We misunderstand or misapply, or we find an element in it that suits our narrative, and so we run with that, right? So what I think has been quite succinctly and respectfully kind of addressed in this particular kind of a concern is that there are different types of human memory, and we have memory that's related to skills, right? You repeat something over and over, and right. I was looking for the categories here, my notes, and that doesn't really apply to what we're talking about. Yeah, procedural memory, and then you have the semantic and episodic. Semantic memory is when you read something and you learn it, or you hear it and you learn it. So that's semantic meanings that you're hearing. Episodic then are the things that we engage or that we get to participate in or witness, experience. And so there's been, so scholars have been dutifully trying to apply these different categories to the realm of things attributed to Jesus, whether spoken or deeds. And one of the things that I'm most compelled by in all of it is that Bart Ehrman, whose work I use his textbook as my required textbook at UP. We cover the Bible in one semester using his textbook, the Bible. And then over at PCC, we have two different courses, one for the Hebrew Bible and one for the Newer Testament. And we use the same textbook for those two courses. So I use his scholarship and I appreciate it. I don't appreciate how snarky he is at times. And I think that he's forgotten what it's like to be the person whose beliefs are being directly challenged. I'm debating bringing that up with him. He and I have been having an exchange for the last year or so over email. But one of the things that I saw was Allison and then also Ehrman have this tendency to dwell on the individualistic a bit too much. And Ehrman's focus on how memory plays in the passing along of the stories that became the Gospels actually sounds quite similar to what his primary focus was in PhD work, which was text criticism. And text criticism does go one to one to one to one, right? You have a text and it's copied. And when you copy it, sometimes you do introduce unintentionally errors, and sometimes you intentionally introduce them. But I'm going to read, not, again, this isn't about mocking or judging, but there are quite a bit of students who come into my classroom now who have this framework in mind. And so whether it was by, Bart and other scholars doing, or if it was just kind of more this common sense, or if it came out of this critical voices critical of religion, and therefore one of the best ways to be critical is to take down Jesus at the knees. I don't know. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but here's one of the things that, I've read in the text that I use, right? So Ehrman is talking, and he has this kind of telephone game way of talking about the passing along of the stories, right? And who was telling the stories about Jesus, he says. In almost every instance, it was someone who had not known Jesus or known anyone else who had known Jesus. Let me illustrate. I'm a coppersmith who lives in Ephesus. A stranger comes to town and begins to preach. I hear all the stories he has to tell and decide to become a follower of the Jewish God and Jesus, his son. I then convert my wife based on the stories that I repeat. She tells the next door neighbor, and she converts. This neighbor tells the stories to her husband, a merchant, and he converts. He goes on a business trip and tells his business associate the stories. He converts and then tells his wife, who also converts. This woman has heard all sorts of stories about Jesus, and from whom? One of the apostles? No, from her husband. Well, from whom did he hear them? He heard them from the next door neighbor, the merchant of Ephesus. Where did he hear them? His wife. And she, right? And it all comes back to, where did I hear them? An eyewitness? No, I heard them from a stranger who came to town. This is how Christianity spread year after year, decade after decade. There are several pieces of this picture that I personally, as a scholar, disagree with, and I disagree with him often, it's okay. But it's an interesting element, not just because it sounds like he's applying text, understandings of traditions of texts passed along and applying that here to narrative, but he's also stepping away from what I think, can't say we all, because he doesn't right now at least see it this way, but the whole point of the traditions are for community, right? And community identity, community connection, cohesion. So the individualistic piece is an interesting eruption, right? That's not how traditions are created and passed along, and that's not why, right? They're for community. And when we talk about community and memory, that is remarkably solid and stable. When we're talking about stories that have been passed along in a context where the people hearing them have an emotional connection or a social connection to them, we as humans and the function of our memories plays out in this moment much more reliably, much more consistently than an independent story that I'm telling ad hoc to connect or relate or adapt to this situation. And of course, in the Gospels, we have both situations. We have both kinds of things happening in the Gospels. But essentially, kind of at the end of the day, regardless of the disconnect between who the guy was and the traditions that built up around him, I'm comfortable kind of sitting back on this, hey, let's not sell short the human memory and the function of the importance of tradition for people, for communities, such that at the level of the events that are central, historical or not, his final dinner, right? The way that is commemorated is remarkably consistent, even though that event is interpreted in different ways. So that something like this question of human frailty, the frailty of human memory, should distress all who quest for the so-called historical Jesus. That really doesn't apply to the predominance of the stories that are, right, that really just doesn't apply to the stories that we're talking about or to the context that we're talking about. Also, some of the other cognitive psychological research that scholars draw upon, they're looking at research that happens where these are undergraduates who are pulled randomly together. They have no connection to each other. They're not trying to retell the story collectively out of their knowing of each other, and right. So even the research itself, other cognitive psychologists have spoken up and said, let's be careful, right? As well as an interesting, because of human curiosity, an interesting focus on the ways that things are altered, because that is interesting. Where even though that isn't the predominant experience. So there have been some interesting engagements. And as scholars tend to do, they're all making some pretty grand stances, claims on whatever it is that they've decided to see. Ehrman no more than anyone else, but he certainly sees what he wants to see. In fact, one of the one of the articles was showing how one of the scholars Ehrman is using for his early work, he then continues to use, even though that same scholar comes back 20 years later and said, actually, I misspoke when I said this, and I now think of it this way. And so that now the scholar that he's drawing upon 40 years ago or whatever actually contradicts the claims that Ehrman is using to make his point. And there's a couple other different ways. What am I getting at here, folks? Again, none of these critiques have been the point. I'm trying to show you what I'm getting tripped up on and what is unsettling to me, because I'm reading all these pale male scholars. And that's another part of the conversation. I have known of 2 Black biblical scholars to contribute to this. One, Mitzi Smith, who is one of the most prolific scholars I will ever know. And she's just getting started. And she contributed an article to the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus because it overlapped with her interests. And she was doing a piece on Thurgood Marshall. And it's a powerful piece. And then there was another biblical scholar who I think hung in there for a few years, a male Black biblical scholar. But that's it. This whole conversation for me comes down to how are we, who is creating the knowledge that we use? Whose lenses are we using in any conversation to talk about the Christ of faith or the Jesus of history? When I process all of this, I start thinking about, I think about these books. I think about Women's Ways of Knowing, The Development of Self, Voice, and Mind, and the interconnectedness of having a voice is about power, right? And having a voice in decisions about actions, that is power. And we're looking at texts that not only do have moments of women in power and influence, but those are all overlooked, even today. But they are also later within the same canon silenced. So we have this collection that serves to silence women. I think of this book, Writing a Woman's Life, the ability to write your own life, to write your own stories or put your voice into writing is a way of creating yourself. And this isn't radical, but the element of, right, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, the reason that having a space to do that is important and has been granted to so many men for so many thousand years, the luxury of the space to write their minds out in ways that women were having the same thoughts but weren't able to do. And so we talk about it today for women as if it's this radical idea when it's something men have done and it's just their right. I think of Women, Sex, and Power Toward a Feminist Historical Materialism by Nancy Hartsock. I think of her work because of what it says about power, what it says about class, whose understandings, whose theories are we engaging for talking about knowledge? Who gets to define the framework of what counts as legitimate? I can't find which book it was I saw this in during my doctoral reading, but I remember stumbling across just a handful of examples, and it may have been in When Women Ask the Questions, Creating Women's Studies in America. I'm not sure, but I came across this handful of examples in modern contexts of things that we as humans have been told are just normal or just the way things work, but really are really only true for men. And that women, it's actually slightly different. In general, these are obviously essentialized categories, and I don't really think of humans as being in essentialized categories, but in general, you know, you know, just things like, and I'm starting to slowly hear it being corrected, I think, but this whole concept of fight or flight is the response. It's a bunch of bullshit. I've never had a fight or flight reaction, and I've been scared, right? It's different. And so it's different in people. There isn't just one, but I get these, I see these things that are talking, I see these articles, I see these things that are talking about there is one, whatever, fill in the blank. And it's being defined by men. And so a bunch of men are over here splitting hairs over how does memory work? And I want to talk about the fact that there's a Black Jesus who didn't get a fair trial, back to Harriet's point at the beginning. Finally, I think of what can she know, Lorraine Codes, feminist theory, and the construction of knowledge. I think this is the most present piece, even though I don't have as much underlined in it, interestingly enough, when I look through for my notes on it. I'm sorry, but that's what I think of as I do the work for this class. Who is it that's creating the knowledge? Who's getting to decide? I'm reading these scholars who are saying, this guy says correctly X, Y, and Z, and I disagree with what he is saying is correct. Doesn't matter really, because I don't really care about historical Jesus scholarship, because I'm trying to do some things over here about marriage in the Bible. So I don't really care about historical Jesus scholarship, but I care on a different level, right? What do you all think? What are your thoughts?
I'm reminded of Paul Tillich's definition of God, which is, he's very sly in defining God as the object of ultimate concern. So instead of defining God as some object out there that exists on its own, he defines God as that you choose is your object of ultimate concern. And so it really draws you back into what's going on for you, that you are creating this ultimate concern or identifying this symbol as representative of your ultimate concern. That could be money, could be status, could be recognition, it could be love, it could be all kinds of ultimate concerns. That becomes your God.
Survival.
Similarly, Jesus, as an object of ultimate concern through the centuries, becomes a study in, well, what have male-driven institutions chosen to define as their ultimate concern? So the story of Jesus is really the story of how that ultimate concern is expressed over centuries, right? And yet that always exists in tension with the fact that these stories of Jesus defy the very ultimate concerns that these institutions express. For example, that Jesus clearly seems to have been opposed to the temple cult and opposed to the ways in which priesthood deprived human beings of their own dignity. Well, you could, I don't know, anyway, I could say that might be a fairly reliable historical tenet, or it might just be a reasonable conclusion you draw from the parables. At any rate, within our own tradition, there are these narratives that exist in tension with the institutional expression of ultimate concern. And it's in that tension that I find something really wonderful happening, where you've got a person like Francis who chooses a different identity and a different way of life based on his understanding of Jesus and his own experience that lives in tension with the institution within which he lives and also reforms. So that kind of gets out of the question of who was Jesus as some autonomous discrete person who lived 2,000 years ago, and gets more into how are we appropriating those images, symbols, stories, narratives to express our own ultimate concerns. And ultimately it comes down to, if my ultimate concern is that Jesus is expressed in a Jesus of love, how does that compare to Christian nationalists' depiction of Jesus, which is expressing an ultimate concern of dominion and conquest and white supremacy, right? So I don't know, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Matthew. Does anyone else have some responses to any part of what's been shared here?
Well, it's a tedious process, and I'm sure frustrating because it moves so slowly. But actually, you're an important part of this evolution of a new way of looking at things. And of course, I'm sure you get a lot of pushback, and it never goes as far as you'd like it to, but still, you're there doing that.
I appreciate that, Richard.
So one of the things that I've struggled with a little bit is trying to find the relevance in the question of religion in general, given the abuses. And I think that reclaiming or asserting the narrative is a purpose that I can get behind.
Can you say more about that? Would you mind saying more about that, Martha?
Well, I mean, I don't really know where to start. Obviously, I have some processing to do around it, but I kind of started from the position of not seeing any relevance in theology for that is not a lifelong position. That's a relatively recent one. But still being dreadfully interested in the historical question, but trying to figure out what's the relevance. Is it just interest because it's interesting, or is there something else? And I think that question around the tragedy around not owning the narrative is meaningful.
Not just because I did this, I unintentionally kind of shifted while you were in the middle of something, but the tragedy of not owning the narrative, could you say more? I'm sorry, I think I'm not tracking with you, so I'd like you to, if you wouldn't mind saying more about that.
That you were bringing up, that that if the story is entirely interpreted from a perspective that doesn't have meaning for it to you, or that loses you, or that is out of step with our current understanding of life and the importance of multiple cultures, it's harder to understand. I don't know, I'm not saying it very well. I'm just grabbing onto a thread there that I thought I want to explore more.
That's great. Historical questions are, and historical reality or truth is always being moderated, right? It is always being moderated. And the question is, to what extent are we willing to acknowledge that there is a bias involved all along? And to what end, as Matthew was saying much more poetically, right? To what end is any of this relevant? But the historical Jesus versus the cultural appropriations or applications and adaptations of Jesus, and the story of radical love, love, justice is what love looks like in public, right? That story is, I think, is relevant in all times and places. But the cultural application of it, that does become, that is specific, and I don't want to say too much here, but misinterpret what you were saying. I think as a biblical scholar, I care about the power that comes with being able to say something specific about Jesus, right? And when you can say that Jesus would do X, Y, and Z, I mean, it could be, if I were interested, it could be a really interesting thing to go search through Twitter or, Instagram or Facebook posts of things that people saying that this is who Jesus was and how he would respond to any particular event. Because as with what we had at the beginning, that list of profiles, you can use stories attributed to Jesus to justify lots of different things. Sometimes the same story to appropriate or to justify the opposite ends of that whole issue. So for me, the issue of power is very much involved. What are we using the name to do, to justify, to build a stance or to justify an action? If you can say that Jesus would have stood for it, Jesus would have been out there in that fight, then you can feel very comfortable making your claim, right? I feel like I'd like to end on a little more upbeat of a note than that. One of the things that I came across, one of the other things that I came across a couple different ways and times was this idea of the Gospels themselves, as we've inherited them, came out of a free and living tradition, that people were, from the very, very earliest stages, people were taking stories and were adapting them in order to say something important. And I don't think you have to be Christian in order to be able to identify with that and to see the value. Well, maybe I should take that back. I see a very strong value in identifying with social justice, and justice is what love looks like in public. That idea, that's Cornel West, but that idea of understanding Jesus's comments, Jesus's claims, his righteous anger, all of those things, right? That the person, the movement, whatever it was that was behind it all, what was done with it in the tradition, free, alive, living, adapting, we can, I think, continue to adapt in our current contexts in similar ways to what that originating movement and impulse was, I think. Go forth in the love and the grace of that vision, right?